Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webcast today called Mythbusters, Dispelling Myths About the Gluten-Free Diet. I'm Vanessa Weisbrod from the Celiac Disease Program at Children's National Medical Center. And with me today, I have Kate Raber from our education team. Kate is going to be fielding questions that come in today. So if you have any questions that come up during the webcast, you can type them in a couple of different places. There's a questions box. There's also a chat box. You can type your question into either one of those fields and they'll go straight to Kate and she will let me know there's questions and we'll answer them throughout the presentation. So thank you again for joining us and let's get started. So many of you might be asking, why are we having a webcast called Mythbusters and why are there myths out there about celiac disease and the gluten-free diet? Well, the truth is that with social media and lots of rapid ways of communicating in this day and age, there's lots of misinformation that is floating around. And the topics we're going to cover today are things that we get questions about in our clinic almost every single day. And so we want to make sure that we're setting the record straight and giving our patients and families the best information out there so that you not only know the information, but that when you see misinformation flying around, you can help us bust these myths and give people the correct information. So we're going to talk about a number of different topics today. I always start my presentations with this beautiful picture of Dr. Bear in the supermarket, just because I love the idea of reminding ourselves that with celiac disease, food is our medicine. And when you hear the word disease, a lot of people tend to think, oh, you can just take a pill, you can get a shot, you can have surgery. But as we all know, with celiac disease, that is definitely not the case. So just a reminder that food is our only medicine. So let's just quickly look at the topics we're going to talk about today. The notion that a gluten-free diet means zero gluten, that there's lots of gluten in many different medications, vaccines contain gluten, that gluten-free oats aren't really gluten-free, arsenic in rice is making gluten-free consumers sick. So these are all fake statements. None of these things are true. So I just want to set the record straight up front. Now we're going to dive in and talk about all of these different topics. So we're going to start out with a strict gluten-free diet means zero gluten. Now, this is a myth. It's true that there are lots of foods that contain no gluten, things like fresh fruits, vegetables, proteins, like fish, beef, poultry, and shellfish, nuts, seeds, legumes, and beans. These are all things that are naturally gluten-free and contain absolutely no gluten. So you could say they have zero gluten in them. But when it comes to foods that are packaged products that contain lots of different ingredients, it's much harder to make that sort of statement. So to begin with, grains are contaminated in the fields. So when you grow any type of a grain in a field, there's just natural things that happen in nature. The wind blows and grains can blow from field to field. Birds could pick up a grain, carry them to another, and drop it on those fields. There are trucks and trains that carry these grains and transport them, and they're not always clean in between transports. So they can become contaminated with gluten. There's also no reliable way to measure to zero gluten in processed foods. And this doesn't just go for gluten. This is the same thing with sugar-free, for example. There's also a threshold for what's considered sugar-free, because sugar occurs naturally in some foods. So there's no reliable way to test to this zero number. The most sensitive test that we have to measure gluten is the ELISA test, and it measures most accurately at 20 parts per million of gluten. And this is the standard that the FDA has deemed safe for consumption in people with celiac disease. There are some tests that measure to lower parts, like 5 parts per million, but again, the research has shown us that the most reliable test is at 20 parts per million, which is a very, very safe level to be at. And as I mentioned, these tests that measure lower at 5 or 3 parts per million actually have a really large margin of error. So you're going to get a range of a measurement and you're not exactly sure exactly where it's going to fall. So this is why we say the 20 parts per million is really the place that we need to be. So as I mentioned, there's a gluten-free labeling law that was put into place by the FDA. And this requires that if a manufacturer labels their product as gluten-free, it can't contain gluten, which means wheat, rye, or barley, or any derivatives of those ingredients. Or it must be processed to contain less than 20 parts per million of gluten. So this means that it could go through a cleaning process, a removal process, but there has to be a way to determine that the product is below that 20 parts per million threshold. So what does 20 parts per million look like? It's a really, really tiny amount. So here in this picture, we have 1 million pieces of sand in the person's hand. And then in the circle, we have 20 pieces of sand. So as you can see, it's a very, very tiny part of food sample. So, but when we look at it this way, it's hard to visualize it. So I want to think about what it really means in our daily life. So before we get into that, we're just going to quickly look at the testing. So where did this 20 parts per million come from? So there was a lot of research that happened, and they looked at how sensitive the tests were. So we talked about that already, these 20 parts per million versus 5 parts per million or 3 parts per million. And then they looked at evidence-based research from clinical trials to see what was actually safe for patients with celiac disease. So this little graphic down here just illustrates what I said before about the 20 parts per million being reliably detected versus this 5 parts per million. There's this very big range of where you can reliably detect the gluten that's in the product. So what these studies found is that patients over a 3-month period could handle up to 10 milligrams a day of gluten with having no reactions. This means they had no antibodies showing up in their blood and they had no damage to their guts. So they determined that up to 10 milligrams a day of gluten was safe. But
so Vanessa, we do have a couple of questions coming in about this.
Okay.
So one of the first questions is with 10 milligrams of, so does that mean that we can cheat sometimes?
So I don't know about you, Kate, but have you ever tried to measure 10 milligrams of gluten? It's a very, very small
I have
amount.
not tried.
It seems like 10 milligrams would be a lot of gluten, but it's actually a very, very tiny amount. So let's take a look at what that would look like. If you were looking at 10 milligrams in gluten-free products, so on the screen here, I have a picture of 18 slices of gluten-free bread, all that contain 20 parts per million of gluten. You would have to eat 18 slices of gluten-free bread to reach the 10 milligrams a day standard. But we're talking about gluten-free products here. But if we wanted to take a leap to the other side and talk about eating pure gluten. So if you wanted to try and eat like a piece of pizza that contained gluten in it, or a regular piece of bread, what would that look like? 1/8 of a teaspoon of wheat flour. So it would be a very, very, very small amount at 10 milligrams that you would be able to eat a day. So, you know, I have 3 different sets of measuring spoons, and not one of them came with 1/8 of a teaspoon measure because it's such a small amount. So we never recommend trying to incorporate 1/8 of teaspoon of gluten into your diet. It's too small, it's almost impossible to measure, and it's putting yourself at risk for a reaction. So, you know, the rule sticks at be gluten-free, do your absolute best to maintain that gluten-free diet.
And so we actually have another question about this too. So what about products that say may contain gluten? Does that also fall under the 20 parts per million rule?
So the gluten-free labeling law only applies to products that have a gluten-free stamp on them. So if a company wants to say that my product is gluten-free and write the words gluten-free on the package, it must meet the 20 parts per million standard. But if you have a product that says may contain gluten, it's not going to have that gluten-free stamp on it and therefore has not been tested to the 20 parts per million or less level. If you do see a product that has that statement on it, I always recommend reaching out to the manufacturer to find out why they put it there. Most of the time, you're not going to see a product that just says may contain gluten or may contain wheat. It will more often say may contain wheat, dairy, soy, eggs, nuts, fish, shellfish, some combination of ingredients that companies are putting there to cover themselves legally in case somebody were to have a reaction. And it most often happens with products that are produced in a facility or factory that is not owned by the company producing them. So there are other products produced there, other companies using the facilities, and they don't have control 100% of the time of the facility. So the best thing to do is to reach out to those companies to find out how they're manufacturing the products, what the cleaning procedures are, and what the real risks are of gluten entering the product so that you can make an educated decision on whether or not you want to feed it to yourself or your family. So now this is a good segue into talking about 20 parts per million gluten in restaurants. So when you go to a restaurant and they have a gluten-free menu, that's a gluten-free label, but it does not fall under the FDA's labeling law. So the law only applies to packaged products that you purchase. So when you go into a restaurant and you see a gluten-free menu, all that means is that the restaurant has decided that they have items that they deem to be gluten-free, but there is no regulation of those products in the restaurant. So let's look at some items. So gluten-free bread, for example, a lot of restaurants now are having a gluten-free bread option. So the restaurant may purchase the bread in a sealed package that says gluten-free on it. But once that package is opened and the restaurant perhaps heats the bread up in the oven or in a toaster, none of the regulations apply any longer. So it's really important that even though the restaurant has a certified gluten-free product, that you still ask questions about how they prepared that product to make sure that it's getting from the package to the table safely. So let's just talk about some takeaway messages from this. We always want to work towards maintaining a strict gluten-free diet. This is always very, very important. The latest research shows us that a teeny tiny amount, up to 10 milligrams a day, is safe for patients with celiac disease. But again, use this information carefully. This is not me telling you it is safe to go eat 1/8 of a teaspoon of gluten every day. This is just showing that there has been research looking at the amount that can be consumed before a reaction occurs in the body. We always want to work towards a strictly gluten-free diet, but it's okay to realize that mistakes will happen and that a tiny amount of cross-contamination is probably not going to cause long-term complications. And that we also want to avoid hypervigilance. So there's been a lot of research that's come out recently looking at people who are overly vigilant on the gluten-free diet, and that being too strict about your diet can actually cause anxiety and depression and a very much lower quality of life. So we always recommend working with a multidisciplinary team that would include a gastroenterologist, a dietitian, a psychologist, and an education specialist to really develop a plan for managing what we call the trifecta of biology, psychology, and foodology. And we think that that's the perfect prescription for maintaining a happy and healthy gluten-free lifestyle. And if any of our listeners out there need help locating a good gastroenterologist, a dietitian, a psychologist, or a team to help with education like Kate and I, we're happy to help. So please do reach out. So moving along to our next topic today, there's a lot of gluten in many medications. So again, this is a myth. For many, many years, we believed that there could be a lot of gluten in medications, but this was because there just wasn't any good information about it. What we know now is that gluten is actually found in very few medications, and the amount is very, very small. So how much? Earlier this year, the FDA released new guidance, and these guidelines said that the amount of gluten found in medication is actually less than the amount of gluten that potentially be found in a single serving of a cookie labeled as gluten-free, in accordance with the FDA's labeling guidelines. So what this means is that when there is gluten used in a medication, it's actually a very, very small amount and would actually be considered a gluten-free product. So how do we use this information? So I want to take just a small step back and talk about why that we find gluten in medications. So when you have a pill, something has to hold it together. And drug companies will use starch to hold the pills together. So things like wheat starch, corn starch, lactose, and they can change these ingredients by lot. So it's not always going to be the same starch. And there's no requirements for labeling these ingredients because they're considered inactive. So if you were to go to your local pharmacy and say, I have an allergy to gluten or wheat, and they would put that in your file, at no time would you ever get an alert telling you that a medication contained it, because there's no rules about the drug companies reporting that information in a way that can be translated to the pharmacies to then become a flag in the system when you pick up your medicine. The only flags that come up are in relation to active ingredients. So for example, if you had a penicillin allergy and that was listed on your account, that would be considered an active ingredient. And so if you tried to pick up a medication that had penicillin in it, the pharmacy would get a flag to say, no, this patient can't take this medicine. The same thing does not happen with the inactive starches in medications. So that's why this becomes a little bit tricky. So now that we know there's only a small amount of gluten in medications, how do we use this in our daily lives? So the good news is that when the FDA did this study, they looked at how many drugs actually contained wheat starch, and at the time, they only found 13 known prescription drugs that contained wheat starch in them. So it's a very, very small number. And now this can change, and if you are wanting to look this information up, we recommend going to the National Library of Medicine's Pillbox website, where you can search by the inactive ingredients in medications and find these drugs. So it can change, but at the time, and when I verified it yesterday, there still were only 13 known prescription drugs that contained it. But the thing to note is that many of these medications were not things that you would take one time and then not be taking anymore. A lot of them were maintenance drugs. So medications like birth control pills, blood pressure medications, ADHD medications. So medications that you would take multiple times a day for a long period of time. So in these cases, what we would recommend is talking to your doctor about an alternative, because if you're going to be taking a pill, say 3 times a day, that we know contains wheat starch, we don't know what the long-term implications of that could be. So in those cases, it is better to find a gluten-free alternative. But the good news is that we know that there aren't too many times that this will become an issue. The other thing to point out is that starch is only found in pills. So if you have a liquid medication, you don't need to worry. There's never been a liquid medication that contains gluten in it. And the other thing I want to point out is that we get a lot of phone calls from families who are in the emergency room and their kids are sick and they need to take a medication immediately. And they're worried that it contains gluten and that it may not work if the medication contains gluten. The thing to remember is that this is a really small amount of gluten, and even if they were to give your child or you a medication that did contain gluten, it's such a small amount that we always recommend containing the emergency first and then looking for a gluten-free replacement for the medication later. Again, remember that in a pill that contains wheat starch, you have less than 20 parts per million of gluten in it. So contain the emergency first, and then if you need to stay on the medication long-term, look for a gluten-free option then. And if you have any questions on this topic, we always point our families towards glutenfreedrugs.com. This is a site maintained by a group of clinical pharmacists at Columbus Children's Hospital. It's an excellent resource, and if you haven't checked it out before, definitely take a look at it. It has all the listings for medications that are gluten-free, so it's a really helpful source. So next we're going to talk about vaccines, the myth being that vaccines contain gluten. So anyone listening has hopefully had all of their vaccines as a child and annually gets a flu shot. We're a children's hospital, so we see lots of young children who are going through their vaccination stages. And over the last few years, there have been a lot of questions on whether or not it's safe for kids with celiac disease to get vaccines and whether or not the vaccines contain gluten. The truth is that vaccines do not contain gluten and are always safe for people with celiac disease. So there is absolutely no truth to the rumors flying around these days that vaccines contain gluten. or that people with celiac disease should not get vaccines. Today, there are 0 vaccines that contain gluten, and there is absolutely no data to suggest that vaccines are unsafe for anybody with celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. The one thing to point out here is that patients with celiac disease could have reacted more weakly to the hepatitis B vaccine as a child and therefore may have not become immune to it. So it is important that if you're diagnosed with celiac disease or your child is diagnosed, that you have their physician check their immunity status to the hepatitis B vaccine to make sure that they did become immune to it. This is part of routine clinical care in pediatric celiac these days. So your gastroenterologist should be doing this already, but if not, it's definitely something to double check on. So I want to talk a little bit about this study from Columbia University. So they were getting lots of people asking about the vaccines and whether or not it was safe for them. So they decided to do a study where they looked at 1,500 people with celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. And what they found is that 25% of people with celiac disease and more than 40% of people with a gluten sensitivity did not believe that vaccines were safe for people on a gluten-free diet. And about 30% of these individuals did not get important vaccines like the flu vaccine because they thought they just weren't safe for people with celiac disease. So as we know, last year there was a very, very bad flu season, and a lot of people unfortunately lost their lives because they did not get vaccinated for the flu. So we just want to set the record straight that the flu vaccine is safe for people with celiac disease. It does not contain gluten, and that celiac disease or sensitivity to gluten is not a reason to forgo getting important vaccinations. All right, so we're going to move on and talk about oats. So the thing that we hear all the time is that gluten-free oats aren't really gluten-free. Yeah, go ahead.
Before we head on to oats, I just had one question come in about vaccines. Is there a possibility of producing a lack of immunity for patients with celiac disease in any other vaccines, or is it just hepatitis B?
The only one that we know of is hepatitis B. And so part of the new guidelines that came out that was led by Dr. John Snyder is that in pediatric programs, they routinely screen kids with celiac disease for a lack of immunity to the hepatitis B vaccine. But right now, that's the only one that we know of. All right, so moving on to
thank you.
So we hear all the time that people think that oats aren't gluten-free because they eat them and they feel sick and they feel like they have a reaction that's similar to when they were to eat gluten. So we want to talk about that and talk about the healthy way for people with celiac disease or a gluten sensitivity to eat oats, because there are lots of really wonderful gluten-free oat products out there. So up on the screen here, I have pictures of lots of different types of oats that you'll find in a regular grocery store. Some of these are gluten-free and some of these are not. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see an oat milk, the Oatly milk. You'll see the gluten-free instant oatmeal from Quaker, where you see a big gluten-free stamp. You have the Bob's Red Mill gluten-free oats with the gluten-free label at the top. The Love Grown oat cups, there's a gluten-free stamp on the bottom. The Kind granola has a gluten-free stamp right there on the front. But then all of the products on the right have no mention of gluten-free on them. And if you were to look closely at their labels, they say nothing about containing gluten or containing wheat, rye, or barley. So for these products on the right, it gets a little bit more tricky to determine whether or not they're safe for a gluten-free diet. The bottom line is that we don't recommend eating any oat product unless it says the words gluten-free on it. If it says the words gluten-free on it, we know that it meets the FDA standard of less than 20 parts per million gluten. If it doesn't have those words on it when it comes to oat products, we don't know, and we have to assume that it does not meet the standard. So now let's talk about why oats could possibly be a problem. Oh, sorry, I missed our truth statement here. Certified gluten-free oats are safe, but again, it's important to understand how they're made and what the labels mean on them. So some patients with celiac disease may also cross-react to the protein in oats. The protein in oats is actually very similar in structure to the gluten protein, and some people with celiac disease just also react to that protein in oats. But we're going to look closer at the labeling of these and what's safe and what's not safe. So let's talk about different types of oats. There are 3 types of oats. There are generic oats that are grown in fields that are adjacent to other crops like wheat, rye, and barley. And there's lots of cross-contamination in the harvest, transport, and processing of them. So what this means is that oats in their natural form are gluten-free. However, these generic oats are grown in a way where there's lots of cross-contamination, and therefore they are no longer safe for a gluten-free diet. And these are the oats here up here on the right-hand side. That's those generic oats. Now, to make oats gluten-free, there are 2 ways to do it. The first are purity protocol oats. These are oats that are grown from pure, uncontaminated seeds that have been grown in fields that have not contained wheat, rye, or barley for at least the last 3 years. These oats are seeded and harvested using dedicated machinery and transported using cleaned equipment and vehicles. And they're processed in dedicated gluten-free facilities and then extensively tested for any potential contamination from gluten. So these are purity protocol oats. The second type of gluten-free oats are mechanically sorted oats. These are oats that have been mechanically or optically sorted to remove any unwanted wheat, rye, and barley from those oats. So these oats would start out as generic oats, but then they would be sorted to make sure that all you end up with are pure oats. And then they're cleaned, and then they're harvested and transported to a facility in which they're produced in a safe gluten-free method. So purity protocol and mechanically sorted oats are these ones that you will find here on the left. Now, the problem is that there's no way of knowing if they're mechanically sorted or purity protocol oats just by looking at the label. If you wanted to know that information, you could reach out to the manufacturer to find out, but looking at the package, they likely are not going to tell you the type of manufacturing they use. But what's important to remember is that if it has the gluten-free sticker on it, there has been a method in place to make sure that they meet that 20 parts per million standard. So we're going to talk a little bit about.
Vanessa, we do have another question coming in here.
Okay.
How can I tell if I'm allergic to oats?
So that's a really good question. And it's one that is most often determined by a process of elimination. So what we recommend for our families at Children's is that when you're diagnosed with celiac disease, in the beginning stages of the gluten-free diet, that you keep oats out of your diet until you are stable. And what that means is that your symptoms have resolved, your TTG antibodies have normalized, and you're feeling good. And once we have determined that the gluten-free diet is working for you, then we ask that our patients add back in a certified gluten-free oat product into their diet. So something that has that gluten-free label on it. And at that point, if you eat the oats and you feel sick from them, and we determine that it's the oats that are routinely making you feel sick, then we ask that you take the oats back out of your diet again and stabilize again so that you're on, if you're feeling good on the gluten-free diet, and then choose a different gluten-free oat product to try one more time to see if the oats are again going to bother you. And then after we've seen a pattern of the oats causing the issues, we could most likely say that you also have a sensitivity to oats, but it's definitely a trial and error process. So now let's talk a little bit about what happened with Cheerios, because this is probably one of the most popular questions that we get in our clinic. So as many of you probably have heard, in 2015, there was a big recall of Cheerios. Cheerios does use a mechanical sorting process for their oats. So they start out as generic oats and then they're sorted. So in 2015, there was a disabled train, and the oats were transferred from clean rail cars that were, considered to be safe for gluten-free to tankers, and the tankers had not been cleaned and had previously contained wheat flour in them. So the oats became contaminated. And there was a small selection of original and Honey Nut Cheerios that were contaminated and then were recalled. So this was a problem for people who had purchased the gluten-free varieties of original and Honey Nut Cheerios. So to make sure that this mistake never happens again, General Mills put a very rigorous testing process in place to prevent errors. So previously, they were not testing the products all along the way of the manufacturing process. So what they've done now is they put into practice 3 stages of testing during the production process. And now for each lot of Cheerios that's produced, 12 to 15 cartons are pulled from the final production area every 2 hours for testing to make sure that they're continually meeting that 20 parts per million or less standard. So they've really done a good job recovering from the mistake that happened in 2015 to make sure that Cheerios with that gluten-free label are safe for the gluten-free diet. So then I just wanted to point out this study. We have a lot of people still feeling uncertain about feeding kids with celiac disease oats. So there was just earlier this year a study that was published in the Journal of Pediatrics that looked at the long-term safety of children with celiac disease eating oats. And so they looked at kids eating oats over a 15-month period, and what they found is that they were absolutely safe. So, this is just one more example that there has been a lot of time dedicated to researching the safety of oats, and that oats are a wonderful addition to your diet, and done in a safe way can really be a great nutritional benefit to people living with celiac disease. So our takeaway message, there is some limitations of data. So the study that we just looked at, it was looking at purity protocol oats. So there haven't been any long-term studies on the safety of mechanically sorted oats. So that is something that we hope they look at in the future. And as I mentioned, before eating oats when you're first diagnosed with celiac disease, we want to make sure that you're stable on the diet, you're not experiencing symptoms, and that you have normalized antibody levels before reintroducing oats into the diet. Then if you do experience symptoms from eating oats, we want to confirm that you're eating actual gluten-free oats, that we take oats out of the diet again, stabilize, and then reintroduce with a different product that is labeled as gluten-free to see if it is actually oats that you're reacting to. And again, as a reminder, oats can be a great part of your diet. So I love this picture of oats as a heart. So next we're going to talk about arsenic in rice. So this is always coming up in the news that the levels of arsenic in rice are bad for people with celiac disease because a gluten-free diet is more heavily based upon rice than a traditional diet might be. So there are lots of different types of rice in the world. There's white rice, there's brown rice, there's sushi and sticky rice and sweet rice and wild rice. So lots of different colors of rice and types of rice. The truth about rice is that we're not actually sure if the arsenic in the rice will make people with celiac disease sick. The studies about the health impact of chronic low doses of arsenic are in the very, very beginning stages. And so we truthfully don't know a whole lot about what this chronic low dose of arsenic will do in the long term. There's also very little data that exists on acceptable levels of arsenic in food and potentially long-term complications from it. So it makes it hard to make a truthful statement. So let's look at what we do know. That arsenic exists naturally in our environment, and it's found in lots of different types of foods. So rice is just one example, but it's also found in fruit juices like apple juice. So it's not just rice that has arsenic in it. There are lots of things in our daily lives. So arsenic is absorbed through soil and water. And while most foods don't absorb that much arsenic from the ground, rice is different because it absorbs the arsenic from the soil and water more readily than other grains do. So therefore, when you harvest the rice, there's more arsenic in those natural pieces of rice grain. So in most cases, you always hear dietitians telling you to eat the whole grain version of a grain because it contains more nutrients. But in this case, brown rice actually has between 30 and 80% more arsenic than white rice does, because the arsenic is actually stored in the outer bran and germ of the rice kernel. And this is the part that becomes removed when they process the rice into white rice and they refine the grain. So in the case of rice, there's actually less arsenic found in the white rice because they've removed the part of it in processing that stores the arsenic. So brown rice is still a whole grain good alternative, but if you're looking at the contents of arsenic, you're going to have way less in the white version than you will in the brown version. And again, like I said, this is confusing because you always hear dietitians recommending the whole grain version versus because it contains more fiber and vitamins. But if we're looking solely at arsenic levels, there'll be less in the white rice. So this is something to talk or to think through with a dietitian, and hopefully over the next few years, we'll start to see more studies published on the real issues of chronic exposure to arsenic in food, and we can give you a better answer on this. So what should we do about it? So since we don't really know a good answer today, how can we reduce the amount of arsenic in our rice before eating it? So one of the best ways to do this is to rinse it before you cook it. So if you do have brown rice or even white rice, you can, I still rinse my white rice at home when I cook it because it removes some of the starch and it makes it cook better and be fluffier. So I always rinse my rice anyways. So what you want to do is rinse the rice under cold water until the water runs clear. And some studies have shown that this can actually reduce the arsenic content by 25 to 30%. So this is not only good for reducing arsenic, but it'll also just make your rice come out much fluffier. So I recommend doing this anyways. There are also so many gluten-free grains in the world that instead of just eating rice all the time, try varying up the different grains in your gluten-free diet. So things like quinoa, corn, millet, teff, oats, sorghum, buckwheat, and amaranth. These are all great options and don't absorb arsenic nearly as much as rice does. So just try switching it up and having different grains in your diet so that you're reducing the amount of arsenic just naturally. And then you could, of course, think about substituting vegetables for grain. So most of the gluten-free pizzas on the market are made using a combination of rice flour and some other grains. But instead of doing this, think about making like a cauliflower pizza crust, or I've actually done a rice cauliflower and broccoli pizza crust. And it tastes delicious and is actually much more nutritious. You can also use these riced vegetables in place of steamed rice. I've made fried rice using riced cauliflower and it's delicious. Instead of using rice crackers to have cheese with, think about using sliced vegetables like zucchini or cucumbers and carrots. Corn chips are a great alternative with guacamole or hummus. So there are lots of ways to reduce the amount of rice that you're getting in your gluten-free diet and to actually boost the nutritious value of the food that you're getting. So now we've talked a lot about things that are myths or fake news. So I want to just talk for a second about real news sources. And those are those that come from our celiac program at Children's National. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with our Celiac Disease and Gluten-Free Diet Digital Resource Center. This is a free app that's available in the Apple and Android marketplaces. It has a ton of resources. There are safe and unsafe ingredient lists, a whole grocery shopping portal, recipes with cooking videos. There's a twice a month podcast. All of our nutrition education classes are available through the app. We have continuing education seminars. We have a whole flashcard deck and travel information. So there's tons of information in the app. If you haven't downloaded it already, I would encourage you to do so. Again, it's absolutely free and available for Apple and Android devices. We also have lots of regularly scheduled activities for our program. We have 3 live classes each month, and we also have our monthly webcast series, which you're all listening to today. So all of these can be registered for through the app. So again, if you haven't already downloaded it, definitely take a second to do that. So Kate, do we have any other questions before we say goodbye today?
We do have a couple of other questions.
Okay.
One of them is, what if your child is a picky eater and resistant to eating healthier?
So that's a great question. So I have a 2.5-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I wouldn't necessarily call them picky eaters, but there are definitely days when they just refuse to eat things that I would consider good for them. So I like to find fun ways to incorporate good food into their diet. So for example, we're only in the beginning of this school year, and there have been a lot of birthdays at school. And so thankfully, the director of my son's preschool has been great about bringing in gluten-free options. But in the past 2 weeks, he's had two different types of gluten-free donuts. He's had chocolate muffins, he's had cookies and cupcakes at school. So he is all about sugar. So for breakfast the past few days, he's been demanding gluten-free donuts, which is okay once in a while, but I don't want him to do it every morning. So this morning, we were looking at Pinterest for fun ideas of things to make for breakfast. And he found a picture of an apple that was, sliced in thin little slices. So it looked almost like a slice of toast. And then it had peanut butter spread on top of it and then granola on it. And so we made these they almost looked like butterflies when we finished with them, but they were just slices of apple with peanut butter and granola on them, and he absolutely loved eating it, and he felt excited to eat it because he made it himself. So I find that kids interacting with their food is a really good way to get someone who might not otherwise choose something to then want to eat it because they made it themselves and it's their accomplishment that they're eating. So I would encourage you to get your kids into the kitchen, take them to the grocery store, and let them pick out something that they want. In the produce section alone, there are so many vibrant colors and cool shapes of foods. So take your kids shopping and encourage them to pick something out. And, start in the produce section. So don't go to those inner aisles first where they're going to see boxes of cookies and chips and all of those things that we wouldn't consider to be the most nutritious. But start in those outer aisles, the perimeter, where you're going to find things like fruits and vegetables and dairy products and things that your kids might choose that are better for them. And also Pinterest is a really good resource. Just Google healthy snacks or healthy breakfast for kids on Pinterest, and you will find so many options for kids to choose from.
Great, so we do have another question here. Does gluten have to be ingested for a reaction to occur? What if it gets on your skin?
So this is something that we're still looking at, but with celiac disease, you do need to digest it. So in order to have an actual autoimmune reaction to gluten, a person with celiac disease, you must eat it and digest it. However, that doesn't discount that we have a lot of people who report that if they touch gluten, they get a rash. So this would be more of like a contact dermatitis from the gluten. And in these cases, we recommend talking to your gastroenterologist about it or also seeing a dermatologist because you may also just have a dermatitis issue in relation to gluten.
Another one here is, why are gluten-free products so much more expensive than regular food?
That's a great question. So over the last 10 to 15 years, the price has actually come down dramatically. It does still seem as though they are disproportionately more expensive, but the bottom line is that the raw ingredients that go into gluten-free products are more expensive. So wheat flour is pennies. It's very cheap to buy. But when you look at a lot of these gluten-free products, they're made with things like almond flour and coconut flour. And all of these ingredients are much more expensive in their natural form. So it just costs manufacturers more to produce the products. So that's where the price increase comes from. It's also trendy. So the gluten-free diet is the cool thing to do. And so they're increasing prices on things. But as more and more people are getting gluten-free and are demanding gluten-free, and as larger manufacturers are joining the gluten-free marketplace, the prices are slowly coming down.
And then
also,
we have one
really
more question.
The last thing I want to say about prices
Go ahead and
is
finish
that it's
that
really important to shop around. So we did another seminar on shopping on a budget, and what I did was, like, for several days, every day I looked at the prices of gluten-free products at like 4 or 5 different grocery stores, and I was shocked at the difference in prices for the exact same product in different stores. And they varied by up to $2 a product, and it wasn't always. So you would just guess that Whole Foods would always be the most expensive, but in many cases, Whole Foods was actually the least expensive of some of the stores. So I would absolutely recommend shopping around, looking for coupons, looking at manufacturers directly. So for example, There are lots of gluten-free manufacturers that have deals all the time. So last week for my 5-year-old who has celiac, I bought a case of 6 bags of bagels and all of the whole grain gluten-free bread that he likes. And they had it was a 40% off coupon for like one day. So sign up for all those email lists. I know that it's like really annoying to get a bazillion emails a day, but oftentimes you're going to find yourself with amazing coupons to get really good deals for free shipping, 50% off if you buy, 6 bags of something. And if you have a freezer where you can store them, you'll end up spending a lot less money on things.
Great. And then our last question here is gluten-free food healthier for you?
Oh, that is such an excellent question. So it depends on the type of food that you're talking about. A natural gluten-free diet, when your diet is heavily based on fresh fruits and vegetables, lean proteins, beans, nuts, and seeds, whole grains, it can be extremely healthy. The problems come in when you are eating a lot of packaged products, and many of the gluten-free versions of packaged products have up to double the fat and calories and sugar and sodium that their gluten-containing counterparts have. So it's really important to check the labels of products that you're buying to make sure that they're meeting your nutritional goals. And if you have questions about these things, it's really important to meet with a dietitian to talk about what is realistic for your diet or your child's diet to make sure that they're getting the right amount of nutrients for their daily diets.
All right, and that's all from my end.
All right, well, I want to thank everybody so much for joining us today. And if any questions come up after this webcast, you can reach out to me anytime at vweisbro@childrensnational.org. Also, if you navigate to the handout section of your control panel, you will see a copy of all the slides from today to download as well. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.